Hello you lovely lot and welcome to another video. My name's Katie and today we're going to play around with some paint markers. A few of you mentioned on the recent Scroll the Box video and Beyond the Box video that you would like to see me work a little bit more with this fabulous medium, so I am treating you not to one, not to two, but 3 pieces of artwork created with various paint pens. The paper I'm using is Bristol board because that's what we had in the scroll box, so I've used some of the Frisk paper as well as some other Bristol board paper as well, and they all pretty much perform the same, so there's not really anything to discuss there. And they are a lovely nice A5 format, which yes, it's a little bit smaller than what I'm used to doing, but for a quick fire, quick draw video like this, they're just perfect. So, the first picture I'm doing here, and you may recognise this character if you're a relatively longish time viewer. Well, I say that, but I did it at the start of the year. It is the little mushroom girl I painted for Upcrate, which was back in, I want to say January, when we had the acrylic gouache. For me, I feel like paint pens, the actual acrylic paint that's in there is a little bit like acrylic gouache, and it's relatively matte. You might get the odd one where it's a little bit shinier than usual, but most of the time I tend to find they dry with a matte finish. You do get the odd occasion, perhaps when you haven't mixed it properly and shook it up properly, where you will have a few slightly glossy streaks in there, but that can easily be amended by waiting for it to fully dry and then going back over it again. Now, let's talk about Mushroom Girl here. I need to think of a name for her really, I can't keep calling her Mushroom Girl. Anyway, so I blocked off all of the areas first which contained a lot of colour, and that included the black background, her hair, her skin and her cape. For me, yes, I do get a little bit of shredding, but I still don't think it's the paper that's shredding. I actually think it's the paint on the end of the nib, and that's dry. If it's not the part that's actually pressing on the paper, it's the side that's going to be exposed to air, and it does dry, and eventually you do naturally rotate the pen around in your hand as you're drawing, and those dry bits come off, and you see where I'm coming here. If you make sure that your paint marker is well pumped, and it's got a juicy nib, this sounds so dodgy. And if you just press lightly on the paper, just let it glide over, that is going to reduce those horrible gunky little bits you have to pick off. And that doesn't discriminate against brands either. That happens with Poscas, it happens with the other pens that I'm using here, the loop markers, the Pintors, the Amsterdam ones, all the ones that I've kind of collated over the years through various art subscription boxes. And that is just the nature of these. Unless you actually prime your paper with gesso beforehand, it's just going to do that. Of course, as well, pretty much all of the blocked out areas got 2 layers, and I waited for it to be completely dry so it didn't lift up any of the semi-dry paint. Just make sure it's completely dry. Go and have a cup of tea or something while it's drying, I don't know, but please just promise me you'll make sure it's dry before going over it in another layer, and I promise you it will not look as streaky. I mean, if you think about it, if you emptied all of the paint out of these markers, and yeah, you are going to get slight variations of opacity, and again, that's not exclusive to one brand, but if you poured them all out into a palette or a pan or whatever and applied it with a brush, the chances are you're still going to need to give it another coat. And with some acrylic paints, that is also the same if you're using it at the same consistency there. So please bear that in mind when you use your pens. Anyway, I totally didn't talk much about Mushroom Girl, but I guess you saw it happen on screen. Using the pens and the different levels of highlighting added some nice light effects. The second picture is, of course, a dragon. I haven't done one for a while, and I have got a dragon painting coming up soon, so be sure to make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on that. And I promise you it will be a better dragon than this one. I'm not entirely super happy with how this came out. It wasn't the medium's fault, and maybe I was just trying to force a dragon out when I perhaps shouldn't have done. Again, following the tips I mentioned earlier, light coat of the pen, wait for it to dry, another layer if required. I actually found that the Daler-Rowney Simply range were actually pretty good for not needing quite so many coats. I got them a while ago from Poundland for, you guessed it, £1, and yeah, I'll be honest, they're pretty alright. The nibs themselves are a little bit scratchy, so bear that in mind, but if you don't press on too hard, which is always the key, then it shouldn't be a problem. I also found actually that same scratchy nib with the Edding ones, which was featured in a relatively recent upcrate, and a little bit half and half with the Amsterdam ones. Not so much with the Molotow ones, and obviously Poscas have got quite a soft nib, but it still shreds the paper, or leaves paint bogies, which is a more accurate representation here. One of the things I quite enjoy about using paint pens though is that opaque quality that they have, and it's really good for adding those scale details on, which you've just seen me do. And it's also pretty handy to rectify any little mistakes you make along the way. The only time I felt that they did leave me sort of not feeling great was the clouds in the background on this. And I didn't use a Posca to begin with, but I let it dry, and then I used a different white pen over the top and I let it dry. And off camera I used a Posca brush pen, and it's exactly the same paint in there, and it just would not lighten up anymore, so I just called it a day, and we've just got these semi-transparent clouds or semi-opaque clouds for the background there. I ummed and ahed quite a lot as to whether to give this a black outline or not. It's not usually my favourite way of going around things, but I'm glad I did, and it sort of salvaged it a little bit. And we're on to painting or drawing or both. Number 3. And let me know down in the comments if you're still here by putting some form of jellyfish or octopus in the comments. So I'm using one of the pastel colours through Posca, and again it needed 2 coats. I actually found that some of the Poscas were pretty streaky, and I'd given them a really good mix. I'd applied them lightly, but certain colours are not going to be that opaque. I think they probably make them like that because if they made them too opaque, maybe the paint inside's not going to flow through quite as much. So, you know, take that into consideration. I mean, it's pretty obvious really, you should usually swatch out your materials first just to see how they behave on the surface as well as how they interact with one another. If you notice it perhaps needs another coat, then just give it another coat. It's no different than if you're swatching or using paints, and some areas might need more than 1 layer. It's just how it is. Now, I thought I would go for a general all-round pastel-y colour theme here. And the pink paint pens that I'm sure I had a while ago in Upcrate, I think it was the Amsterdam ones I was using on screen there, they worked really nicely for it. That pink is very similar to the pastel pink that Posca does. I did try and add some additional details in there, but as you can see, it's not really making much of an impact there, so I scrapped that idea pretty quick. But I thought using a white Posca pen would do the trick, and as you can see, I mean, Posca probably hold the monopoly over this, but it's not much more opaque than any other white pen that I've used that's a paint marker. Just saying. I must admit though, I do like the variety of nibs you can get. You can get ones that are like a fine liner, you can get ones that are like those fine tip brushes, but it's not actually a brush, they call them brushes, you see them with the liners. I don't recommend them. They are really scratchy, they will actually shred your paper because it's a lot harder than the fibre nibs, so bear that in mind. I suppose they're really perhaps more of a stationary item rather than an art supply. Obviously as well, you can get the Posca brush. I only have one of them and it's white, and I didn't see the point in featuring it as such, as it's a little bit different from the rest. I quite like the Pintors as well. I think Their nibs are somewhere in between a scratchy one and a squidgy one, if that makes any sense, but I thought they were quite nice for doing details, but still held up quite well for larger areas that needed that. The ones that surprised me most though, and again it is the Daleroni ones, aside from the black which I didn't use on here because it's very much like a dark grey rather than a true black, I liked them. What can I say? You don't need to use as many coats. Yeah, the nib's scratchy, but if you can get used to that and not put too much pressure on your drawing, it's fine. The ones that leaked the most were the Poscas. Again, with doing lots of dot work, it probably activates that push mechanism in there, and then when it comes to doing a larger area, it kind of just splats everywhere. So I guess bear that in mind for doing certain details here. The only paint pens that I've probably got one or two of that I haven't featured are the Derwent ones, and I do not get on with them at all. Every time I've used them, they've just leaked and I've given up on them now. They've just been relegated to the dead supplies box. That aside though, I do actually quite enjoy paint markers. I think they're fun. I can't really say I do a lot of my serious work with them. They're good for touching up little areas, perhaps on an acrylic painting, but aside from that, they're just fun. I don't discriminate against brands. If it works well, it works well, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. I do recommend though using a very smooth paper if you're going to use paper. Anything porous, it's just gonna, it will shred. It will shred. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know it's been a bit of a rambly one, but you know, I do like to have a little ramble and a little waffle. I want to say thank you so much for watching, and there should be a couple of videos I think you're going to enjoy. And I'll see you lovely lot next time. Bye!